The Carnival of Midnight. A mysterious carnival appeared overnight on the outskirts of town, its bright lights and cheerful music beckoning visitors. Its attractions were strange and wondrous, a hall of mirrors that showed glimpses of other worlds, a Ferris wheel that seemed to reach the stars, and a fortune teller who spoke in riddles. Emma, a thrill-seeker, couldn't resist. She wandered the carnival, marveling at its oddities, until she stumbled upon the main attraction, the Midnight Tent. The barker warned her not to enter unless she was ready to see her true self. Intrigued, Emma stepped inside. The tent was dark, its air thick with incense. At the center was a single mirror, cracked and glowing faintly. As Emma approached, her reflection shifted. It showed her not as she was, but as she could have been. Her darkest thoughts, her hidden fears, her worst mistakes. The reflection spoke. "Stay, and we'll trade places." Terrified, Emma tried to leave, but the tent had disappeared, replaced by endless darkness. The carnival was gone the next day, leaving only trampled grass and Emma's empty car behind. Locals say the carnival still appears in other towns, always vanishing before dawn, always leaving someone behind. 1. The Road That Never Ends. It was a chilly autumn night when David set out on a long drive to visit his family. He decided to take a scenic route, one he hadn't traveled before, that wound through dense woods and rolling hills. The GPS warned him that the road was poorly lit and rarely used, but David was in no rush. An hour into the drive, he noticed something strange. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, with no intersections or signs of civilization. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining above him to block out the moonlight. He checked his GPS, but the screen glitched, showing him in the same spot he'd been 20 minutes ago. The road began to curve, leading him past familiar landmarks, a fallen tree, an old gas station sign, and a rusted car half buried in the underbrush. David realized with growing unease that he'd seen them before, though he hadn't turned around. The radio crackled, and a voice whispered, "Turn back." David glanced at the screen, but it was blank. He turned it off, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. Hours passed, and the night deepened. His gas gauge inched toward empty, but the road refused to end. Just as panic began to set in, he spotted headlights in his rearview mirror. Relieved, he slowed down, expecting the other car to pass, but it stayed at a distance, following him. When he sped up, so did the car. When he slowed down, it matched his pace. Frustrated, David pulled over, but as soon as his car stopped, the other vehicle disappeared into the darkness. The forest around him was silent. Too silent. He decided to keep driving, desperate to find a way out. Hours turned into dawn, but the sun never rose. The road twisted endlessly ahead, the same landmarks repeating like a sinister loop. David's car was found abandoned weeks later, the engine cold and the gas tank full. The road he had traveled was overgrown, no longer accessible to cars. Some say his ghost still drives it, searching for a way home. 2. The Forgotten Church. Deep in the countryside stood an abandoned church, its once white steeple now blackened with soot. The locals called it St. Hollow's Ruin and avoided it, claiming it was cursed. It was said that the congregation disappeared one Sunday morning during a mass, leaving the pews empty and the altar untouched. Alice, a documentarian, decided to investigate. She arrived at the church late one afternoon, her camera in hand. The air around the building felt colder than it should have been, and the wind carried faint whispers that she dismissed as rustling leaves. Inside, the church was eerily preserved. Dust coated the pews, and cobwebs draped the stained glass windows, but everything else was intact. The hymnal books were open to the same page, and an unfinished cup of tea sat on a side table near the altar. Alice began filming, her footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. As she approached the pulpit, she noticed a strange pattern on the floor, a large, circular scorch mark that hadn't been visible from the entrance. It radiated an oppressive energy, and the whispers grew louder. She heard the sound of a door creaking open and turned, expecting to see someone else, but the entrance was still shut. When she turned back to the pulpit, a figure stood there, a tall, shadowy man with hollow eyes and a pale face. His lips didn't move, but his voice echoed in her mind. "You're too late." Terrified, Alice fled the church, but the whispers followed her. She tripped and fell near the cemetery outside, and when she looked up, the graves were no longer empty. Figures stood beside the tombstones, their faces turned toward her, watching silently. Alice's camera was found near the altar, its footage showing her panicked flight through the church. The final frame captured the shadowy man standing at the door, his hollow eyes glowing faintly. 3. The Lake of Lost Faces. In a remote forest, there was a lake so still and dark it resembled a mirror. Locals called it the Lake of Lost Faces and told stories of those who stared too long into its waters. They said the lake showed you not your reflection, but the parts of yourself you kept hidden, your fears, regrets, and darkest thoughts. Lila, a painter searching for inspiration, stumbled upon the lake during a hike. The air around it was unnaturally quiet, and no birds or animals stirred nearby. She felt an inexplicable pull toward the water's edge, her curiosity overpowering her unease. As she gazed into the lake, her reflection shifted. It showed her, but not as she was. The reflection was distorted, with sunken eyes and a twisted grin. Lila stumbled back, but the reflection remained, staring up at her. That night, she camped nearby, unable to shake the image from her mind. She dreamed of the lake, its surface rippling as shadowy figures rose from the depths. They called her name, their voices soft but insistent. When she woke, she was standing by the lake, though she didn't remember leaving her tent. Her reflection was waiting for her, now grinning with sharp, inhuman teeth. It spoke, though its lips didn't move. "Come closer." Terrified, Lila tried to leave, but the ground beneath her felt soft, pulling her closer to the water's edge. The last thing she saw was her reflection reaching out, its clawed hands breaking the surface to pull her under. Hikers found her tent days later, but Lila was gone. The lake remained undisturbed, its surface smooth and dark. Some say her face can still be seen in its depths, waiting for the next person to look too closely. 4. The Doll in the Attic. When Sophie inherited her grandmother's house, she wasn't thrilled. The creaky old Victorian was falling apart, its walls lined with peeling wallpaper and its floors groaning with every step. But it was hers, and she planned to renovate it. While cleaning out the attic, Sophie found a dusty trunk tucked into a corner. Inside was an old porcelain doll with glassy blue eyes and golden curls. Its dress was faded but elegant, and its painted smile seemed oddly lifelike. Sophie placed the doll on a shelf in the living room. thinking it would add a touch of vintage charm. But that night, she heard faint footsteps in the hallway. She dismissed them as the house settling, but when she woke the next morning, the doll was sitting on her bedside table. As the days passed, the doll seemed to move on its own. It appeared in different rooms, its glassy eyes always fixed on Sophie. At night, she heard soft laughter and the sound of tiny footsteps. One evening, Sophie decided to lock the doll in the attic. She placed it back in the trunk, securing it with heavy chains. But when she returned to her bedroom, the doll was waiting for her, its painted smile now wider and more menacing. The next morning, Sophie's neighbors found her house empty. The doll sat in the attic, its glassy eyes glinting in the sunlight. Over the years, new owners reported the same strange occurrences, but no one ever stayed long. The doll remains in the house, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to keep it. 1. The room with no number. On the top floor of the old Willow Creek Hotel, there was a door with no number. Guests claimed to have seen it at the end of the hall, but no one could recall exactly when it had appeared. The staff avoided discussing it, brushing off questions with nervous laughter or hurried explanations. Evan, a travel writer, checked into the hotel for a quiet retreat. Curious about the rumors, he asked the receptionist about the mysterious door. The man grew pale and whispered, "Don't go looking for it. It's not meant to be opened." That night, as Evan roamed the dimly lit halls, he found the unmarked door. It stood slightly ajar, revealing a dark void beyond. A faint chill emanated from within, and he swore he heard whispering voices calling his name. Against his better judgment, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was pitch black, but as Evan's eyes adjusted, he saw faint shapes moving in the shadows. The air was heavy, and the whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a deafening hum. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, and the room began to change. The walls stretched and warped, twisting into grotesque faces that screamed silently. The floor shifted beneath Evan's feet, and the void seemed to pull him deeper into its darkness. He tried to open the door, but it had vanished, replaced by a blank wall. The next morning, the hotel staff found Evan's belongings in his room, but there was no sign of him. The door with no number was gone, as if it had never existed. Yet some nights, guests still hear faint whispers at the end of the hall. 2. The shadows in the playground. In the heart of a quiet suburb stood an abandoned playground. Its swings rusted and its merry-go-round frozen in time. Parents told their children to stay away, claiming the place was haunted by the spirits of those who had disappeared there. Megan, a high school senior, didn't believe the stories. She and her friends decided to explore the playground one evening, daring each other to spend an hour in its eerie silence. At first, it seemed like nothing more than an overgrown park. The air was still, and the fading light cast long shadows across the cracked pavement. The friends laughed nervously as they climbed the jungle gym and sat on the swings. But as the sun set, the shadows grew darker, deeper. Megan noticed something strange. The shadows weren't just cast by the structures. They seemed to move independently, shifting and twisting toward her friends. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing to a particularly dark patch beneath the slide. The shadow seemed to rise, taking on a vaguely human form. Her friends laughed it off until the shadow reached for them. Its long, clawed hand stretched unnaturally, grasping at one of the boys. He screamed as the shadow dragged him into the darkness. his voice cutting off abruptly. The others ran, but the shadows pursued them, darting across the ground and blocking their path. Megan tripped and fell, feeling cold hands wrap around her ankles. She clawed at the dirt, pulling herself free and escaping the playground. The next day, her friends were reported missing, and the playground was cordoned off. Megan swore she could still see the shadows moving when she passed by, watching, waiting. 1. The room that changes. In the heart of the city, there was an unassuming hotel known as the Hollow Inn. Its rooms were ordinary save for one, room 428. Staff avoided cleaning it, and guests were rarely assigned to it. Those who stayed often complained that the room seemed to change, furniture shifting positions, the wallpaper pattern warping, or the windows leading to different views every time they looked out. Elena, a traveling consultant, arrived late one night and was assigned room 428 without a second thought. Exhausted from her journey, she barely noticed the receptionist's hesitation as he handed her the key. The room was quaint, with a vintage charm. A simple bed, a small desk, and an armchair by the window made up the space. But Elena couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The mirror above the desk seemed too reflective, almost alive, and the ticking of the antique clock on the wall was irregular, speeding up and slowing down unpredictably. As she settled in, Elena noticed the view from the window didn't match her memory of the building's surroundings. Instead of a bustling cityscape, she saw a dense, foggy forest. Shrugging it off as exhaustion, she went to bed. At midnight, she awoke to the sound of shuffling. The armchair was now positioned in the middle of the room, facing the bed. The clock had stopped ticking, its hands pointing to an impossible time, 13:13. The air was thick, and a faint whisper seemed to echo from the mirror, "Leave." Terrified, Elena grabbed her phone, only to find her screen blank. The room felt alive, shifting subtly as if it were breathing. She opened the door to escape, but the hallway outside was gone, replaced by an endless black void. In desperation, Elena turned to the mirror. Her reflection smiled at her, though she hadn't moved. "You'll stay," it whispered. The next morning, the receptionist found room 428 empty. Elena's belongings were gone, and the room looked untouched, as if no one had ever been there. But staff swore they occasionally heard faint footsteps and laughter coming from inside. 2. The lights on Widow's Hill. Every town has its legends, and for the residents of Greystone, the tale of Widow's Hill was the most chilling. They said a woman once threw herself from the cliff after losing her husband at sea, and on stormy nights, strange lights would appear, luring travelers to their doom. Nathan, a skeptic and amateur historian, decided to investigate. He set out on a blustery evening, armed with a flashlight and a camera. The path to Widow's Hill was treacherous, the wind howling as waves crashed against the rocks below. As he approached the summit, he saw them. Faint, flickering lights hovering over the edge. Intrigued, Nathan moved closer. The lights seemed to dance, growing brighter as he neared. His camera began to malfunction, the screen glitching as if the lights were interfering with the signal. When he reached the edge, he felt a sudden, overwhelming pull, as if the wind itself were trying to drag him forward. Through the mist, he thought he saw a figure, a woman in a flowing dress, her face obscured by shadows. "Come closer," she whispered, her voice carried by the wind. Nathan stumbled back, but the pull grew stronger. He turned to run, but found the path behind him had disappeared, replaced by jagged rocks and crashing waves. The figure stepped closer, her features now visible. Her face was pale and hollow, her eyes empty sockets. "Stay with me," she pleaded, reaching out with skeletal hands. Nathan's scream was swallowed by the storm. The next day, his camera was found at the base of the cliff, the final image showing a blurry, ghostly figure surrounded by glowing lights. 3. The diner that never closes. Along a lonely stretch of highway, there's a diner known as Earl's 24-Hour Grill. Travelers often stop there for a late-night coffee or a warm meal, but some never leave. Jenna, a college student driving cross-country, pulled into the diner just after midnight. The neon sign flickered faintly, casting a dim glow over the empty parking lot. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee and grease. The waitress, an older woman with tired eyes, greeted her with a smile that didn't reach her face. Jenna ordered a burger and coffee, trying to shake off the eerie atmosphere. The other patrons were silent, staring blankly at their plates or out the windows. She felt like an intruder. When her food arrived, Jenna noticed something strange. The burger looked almost too perfect, the coffee unnaturally still despite her movements. She took a bite, but the taste was metallic, wrong. The waitress stood nearby, watching her intently. "Is everything okay?" Jenna asked. The waitress tilted her head, her smile widening unnaturally. "You'll get used to it." The clock on the wall ticked loudly, but the hands didn't move. The patrons began to turn, their faces pale and distorted. One by one, they whispered, "Stay." Panicking, Jenna bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The windows showed only darkness, the highway and her car gone. The waitress stepped closer, her features now twisted into something inhuman. "You can't leave," she said. Years later, the diner still stands. Travelers report seeing Jenna inside, sitting at a booth and staring blankly at the door. 4. The shadow at the window. Sam had just moved into his first apartment, a small but cozy space on the edge of town. The building was old, its creaky floors and drafty windows a testament to its age. On his first night, as he unpacked, he noticed the window in the living room faced a dense forest. The view was calming, though the trees seemed unnaturally still. Around midnight, Sam heard a faint tapping. He assumed it was a branch brushing against the window, but when he looked, there was nothing outside. Just darkness. The tapping continued every night, growing louder and more persistent. Sam began to dread sundown, knowing the sound would return. One night, he decided to stay awake and watch the window. At exactly midnight, the tapping started. This time, a shadow appeared, a tall, thin figure standing just beyond the glass. Sam froze. The figure had no face, just a blank, dark void where its features should have been. It raised a hand and tapped the window, the sound echoing through the room. Sam turned on the lights, but the figure remained, motionless. He called the police, but when they arrived, there was no one there. They dismissed his story as nerves or stress, but Sam knew what he had seen. The figure began appearing every night, closer each time. One evening, Sam awoke to find it standing inside the room, its void-like face inches from his own. The next day, Sam's apartment was found empty, his belongings untouched. The window, however, bore long, deep scratches, as if something had clawed its way inside. 1. The endless doorway. In the small town of Galeswood, there was a peculiar antique shop called Timeless Finds. The store was filled with strange and eerie items, but none more infamous than the endless doorway. It was a wooden frame with intricate carvings, standing free in the middle of the shop. The shopkeeper, an elderly man named Arthur, always warned visitors not to step through it. When Mia, an avid collector of curiosities, visited the shop, she was instantly drawn to the doorway. It seemed to hum faintly, a sound she could barely hear but couldn't ignore. "What happens if I step through?" she asked Arthur. He looked at her gravely. "You'll find yourself somewhere you can't leave." Ignoring his warning, Mia returned to the shop that evening, slipping in after closing hours. The doorway seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Curiosity overwhelming her fear, she stepped through. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, she was somewhere else entirely. She stood in a long, dimly lit hallway lined with endless doors, each one identical. The air was heavy, the walls pulsing faintly as though alive. She turned to step back, but the doorway had vanished. As Mia moved forward, she heard faint whispers behind the doors, some crying, others laughing, and some speaking words she couldn't understand. When she opened one, she saw a version of herself sitting alone in her apartment, staring blankly at the wall. The figure turned and smiled at her, its eyes dark and hollow. Panicked, Mia slammed the door and ran, but the hallway twisted and stretched, the doors multiplying. One opened on its own, and a shadowy figure stepped out, its elongated limbs reaching for her. Days later, Arthur found the doorway glowing brightly. A faint, desperate scream echoed from within. He sighed, closing the shop for the day. The doorway hummed softly, waiting for its next victim. 2. The Whispering Portrait. The Mathers estate was an imposing mansion, abandoned for decades after the mysterious disappearance of its last residents. Among its many eerie features, the most infamous was the portrait of Lady Evelyn Mather, the original owner. Her painted eyes seemed to follow anyone who looked at her, and visitors claimed to hear faint whispers when they stood near the painting. Rachel, a historian fascinated by the Mathers family, secured permission to study the estate. When she arrived, the portrait was just as unnerving as she'd heard. Lady Evelyn's face was serene, yet her eyes held a knowing, almost mocking expression. That night, as Rachel reviewed her notes in the library, she felt an odd sensation, like she was being watched. Looking up, she saw the portrait hanging on the wall, though she was certain it had been in the foyer. As the hours passed, the whispers began, soft at first, growing louder until they formed words. "Help me." Rachel, both terrified and intrigued, approached the portrait. Lady Evelyn's eyes seemed alive, her lips faintly moving. The next morning, Rachel found a journal hidden behind the painting. It belonged to Lady Evelyn and spoke of dark rituals her husband had performed to trap her spirit in the portrait. Desperate to free her, Rachel decided to destroy the painting. But as she lit the match, the whispers turned to screams. The room filled with shadows, and Lady Evelyn's face twisted into something monstrous. "You can't leave me here!" she shrieked. Rachel's body was found weeks later, lifeless before the intact portrait, her face frozen in terror. The painting was moved back to the foyer, its whispers now louder than ever. 3. The Village That Fades. Hidden deep in the mountains, there was a village that didn't appear on any map. Travelers who stumbled upon it spoke of its quaint charm, its cobblestone streets, and its friendly but reserved inhabitants. but those who stayed too long discovered its sinister secret. Jack, a photographer, found the village while hiking. It seemed like a perfect subject for his portfolio, timeless and untouched by modernity. The villagers welcomed him warmly, offering him a place to stay and sharing their simple meals. But as the days passed, Jack noticed strange things. The villagers never left the village square. Their smiles were too wide, their laughter echoing unnaturally. At night, the streets were deathly silent, and the air grew so cold his breath froze in the air. One evening, Jack ventured out after dark. The village seemed different. The houses were fading, their edges blurring as though dissolving into the night. He heard faint whispers and saw shadowy figures moving just beyond the lamplight. He tried to leave the next morning, but the path he'd taken into the village was gone. The forest surrounding it stretched endlessly in every direction. The villagers, once friendly, now stared at him with vacant eyes. Jack's journal was found years later in the ruins of the village. It ended with a single line: "The village is fading, and so am I." For the lighthouse of the drowned. On a rocky island off the coast, there stood an abandoned lighthouse. Sailors avoided it, claiming it was cursed. They said the light would flicker on during storms, luring ships to their doom. Evelyn, a marine biologist, dismissed the stories. She rented a boat and made her way to the island, determined to investigate. The lighthouse loomed tall and foreboding, its windows broken and its paint peeling. Inside, the air was damp, and the walls were covered in strange carvings, names etched in jagged lines, all crossed out. That night, as Evelyn explored, she heard the sound of waves crashing, though the sea was calm. The light in the tower flickered on, casting long, eerie shadows. When she climbed to the top, she found a dusty lantern glowing faintly, though there was no flame. Suddenly, the room filled with whispers, and Evelyn saw shadowy figures in the glass of the lantern. They were the faces of sailors, their expressions twisted in agony. One turned to her and mouthed, "Leave before it's too late." But the door to the tower slammed shut. The whispers grew into screams, and the light blazed brighter. Evelyn felt herself being pulled toward the edge, as if the sea itself were calling her. The next morning, her boat was found drifting near the shore, but Evelyn was gone. The lighthouse light flickered on that night, its curse claiming another victim. 5. The Endless Corridor. In an old university, there was a hallway known as the Endless Corridor. Students claimed it appeared only at night, stretching far beyond its normal length. Those who walked it never reached the end, or so the legend went. Liam, a skeptical student, decided to test the myth. At midnight, he entered the corridor, armed with a flashlight. At first, it seemed normal, lined with doors and faded posters. But after a few minutes of walking, Liam realized something was wrong. The hallway stretched on infinitely, the doors identical and unmarked. His flashlight flickered, and he felt the air grow colder. Faint whispers echoed around him, growing louder with every step. He turned to go back, but the way behind him had changed. The exit was gone. Desperate, Liam opened one of the doors. Inside was a classroom, but the desks were empty, and the chalkboard read, "You shouldn't have come." When he turned, the door was gone, replaced by another hallway. Liam was never seen again, but at night, students still hear footsteps in the corridor, along with faint whispers warning them to stay away. 1. The House That Devours. On the outskirts of a small, fog-drenched town, there was a mansion everyone avoided. Known simply as Devourer's Manor, it had stood abandoned for decades, its windows like black, empty eyes staring out over the land. The few who dared enter the house claimed it wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it fed on fear. Eleanor was new to the town, a journalist eager to make her mark by debunking the local legend. Armed with her camera and a notebook, she set out to investigate the manor one cold autumn evening. The gates creaked as she pushed them open, the sound echoing through the silent yard. Inside, the air was thick and cold, heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. The grand staircase was coated in dust, and cobwebs hung like veils from the ceiling. Eleanor turned on her flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness. "Hell," she muttered to herself, making notes about the eerie atmosphere. As she moved deeper into the house, Eleanor felt a strange pull, as if the walls themselves were breathing, watching her every move. The air seemed to press against her, urging her further in. She dismissed the feeling as nerves, determined to uncover the truth behind the house's reputation. In the library, she found a journal left behind by the last resident, a man named Victor Hastings. The entries grew more frantic over time, filled with references to the house's hunger and keeping it fed. One line, scrawled in shaky handwriting, stood out. "It demands more each time. I can't keep it satisfied." A sudden noise upstairs made Eleanor jump. She grabbed her flashlight and climbed the creaking stairs, her heart pounding. At the end of the hall was a door slightly ajar. She pushed it open to find a bedroom frozen in time. The bed was made. A child's doll sat on the dresser, and a mirror leaned against the wall. But the mirror was wrong. Its surface was dark and rippled like water, and as Eleanor stepped closer, she saw her reflection shift. The figure in the glass moved on its own, its mouth stretching into an unnatural grin. It whispered, "You shouldn't have come." The doors slammed shut, and the walls began to groan, the wood twisting and warping around her. Shadows poured from the corners, shapes with glowing eyes that closed in as the mirror's surface rippled violently. The house was alive, and it had chosen Eleanor as its next meal. Eleanor's screams echoed through the halls as the house swallowed her whole, leaving nothing behind. Weeks later, another brave soul entered the manor, drawn by curiosity and the promise of a good story. The house had found its next victim. 2. The train that never stops. Deep in the heart of the countryside, there was a railway line that had long been abandoned. The tracks were overgrown with weeds, the station crumbling into ruin. But, on certain nights, locals swore they heard the sound of a train, its whistle cutting through the night air, its wheels clattering on tracks that no longer carried passengers. Theo, a college student visiting the area, dismissed the stories as folklore, but when he heard the phantom whistle one night, he couldn't resist investigating. Armed with a flashlight and his phone, he followed the sound to the derelict station. The platform was empty, covered in moss and decay. Theo stood there for a moment, the silence unnerving. Just as he turned to leave, he felt a rush of cold air and heard the screech of brakes. A train had appeared, its windows glowing faintly in the dark. Theo's curiosity overpowered his fear. He stepped onto the train, finding the interior oddly pristine. The seats were upholstered in rich velvet, the wood polished to a gleam. But the other passengers were strange. They sat motionless, their faces obscured by shadow, their heads tilted as if listening to something Theo couldn't hear. The train jolted to life, and Theo realized he couldn't get off. The doors were locked, the windows showing nothing but darkness outside. He moved through the carriages, growing more desperate with each step. The passengers turned their heads to watch him as he passed, their eyes glowing faintly. In the last carriage, Theo found a conductor standing silently by the door. His uniform was tattered, his face pale and gaunt. "Where are we going?" Theo demanded, his voice shaking. The conductor smiled, his teeth impossibly sharp. "You're already there." The train came to a sudden stop, and Theo was thrown to the floor. When he looked up, he saw that the other passengers were gone, replaced by shadowy figures with clawed hands. They surrounded him, their whispers filling his ears. The train disappeared into the night, leaving no trace of Theo. Locals still hear its whistle on stormy nights, and those foolish enough to board are never seen again. 3. The clock that counts down. In a bustling antique shop, Kate found a clock unlike any she'd ever seen. It was small, with ornate brass detailing and a single hand that moved in reverse. The shopkeeper refused to sell it at first, muttering about its cursed history. But Kate, drawn to its uniqueness, insisted. That night, the clock began ticking. Kate was certain she hadn't wound it, but the sound was steady and rhythmic, echoing through her apartment. She noticed the single hand slowly counting backward, though there were no numbers on the face. The next morning, strange things began happening. Objects in her apartment were moved, her phone displayed calls she hadn't made, and she woke up with scratches on her arms. The clock continued to tick, its hand moving closer to 0. Desperate for answers, Kate researched the clock's history. She discovered it had belonged to a 19th century inventor obsessed with time. According to legend, he created the clock to trap death itself, but instead it became a beacon, drawing the entity closer with each passing second. As the hand neared 0, the activity in Kate's apartment grew more violent. Shadows moved on their own, whispers filled the air, and the temperature dropped. On the final night, the clock's ticking grew deafening. Kate watched in terror as the hand reached 0. The clock chimed once, and everything went silent. Kate disappeared, leaving only the clock behind. It now sits in the antique shop once more, waiting for its next owner. 4. The Mirror's Curse. Emily loved collecting antiques, and when she stumbled upon an old mirror at a flea market, she couldn't resist. Its frame was carved with intricate patterns of vines and flowers, though the glass was cloudy and seemed to ripple faintly in the light. That night, Emily hung the mirror in her bedroom. She admired how it added an air of elegance to the space, but as she turned to leave, she thought she saw movement in its reflection. She froze, staring, but the glass showed nothing unusual. Over the next few days, strange things happened. Emily's reflection lingered a moment too long, smiling when she wasn't. At night, she heard faint whispers coming from the mirror, calling her name. One evening, she woke to find the mirror glowing faintly. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't her. It was darker, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. "Let me in," it whispered. Terrified, Emily tried to remove the mirror, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, and her reflection began appearing in places it shouldn't, in windows, in puddles, even in the screens of her devices. One night, Emily vanished. The mirror now sits in the flea market again, waiting for its next victim. The house on Black Hollow Road. It was a stormy autumn evening when Ella and her older brother Jake arrived at their late grandfather's house on Black Hollow Road. The house had been abandoned for over a decade, a crumbling relic of the Victorian era, tucked deep in the woods where no one dared venture after dark. The siblings were tasked with clearing it out for sale, an assignment that came with equal parts nostalgia and unease. Their grandfather, Thomas Whitmore, had been a reclusive man in his later years, obsessed with his books and peculiar experiments. The villagers whispered that he dabbled in the occult, summoning forces better left undisturbed. But Ella and Jake dismissed the stories as small-town gossip. Now, standing before the house, its towering silhouette framed by a blood-red sunset, Ella felt a pang of doubt. "Let's just get this over with," Jake muttered, hauling a crowbar from the trunk of the car. The door creaked ominously as they stepped inside. Dust hung in the air like a fog, and the faint smell of damp wood and decay filled their nostrils. The grand staircase loomed ahead, its banister wrapped in cobwebs, and portraits of long-dead relatives lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow the pair as they moved. Ella ran her fingers along an ornate table in the foyer. "It's like time stopped here," she said softly. She picked up a small figurine of an angel, its wings chipped and face worn with age. The sight stirred an odd mix of sadness and foreboding. Jake, ever the pragmatist, was already rifling through the library. "We'll start here," he called out, his voice echoing unnervingly in the empty halls. Ella hesitated. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The shadows seemed deeper than they should have been, and the faint sound of rain on the windows did little to drown out the silence. She joined Jake, forcing herself to focus. The library was vast, with floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with books that smelled of mildew. Jake opened a drawer in the desk and found a thick leather journal. "Look at this," he said, flipping it open. The pages were filled with notes, diagrams, and strange symbols scrawled in a shaky hand. Ella peered over his shoulder. "Grandpa's handwriting," she murmured. "What are these rituals?" Jake snorted. "It's nonsense." He was probably going senile. But Ella wasn't convinced. The diagrams depicted circles surrounded by symbols she didn't recognize, and one phrase repeated throughout the journal: "The gate must remain closed." "What gate?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake set the journal aside with a shrug. "Who knows? It's all just creepy stories to me." But as they continued sorting through the house, strange things began to happen. The faint sound of footsteps echoed in the halls, though no one else was there. Doors they'd left open were now shut, and objects seemed to move of their own accord. At first, they chalked it up to the wind or their imaginations, but by the time night fell, the air in the house felt heavy, oppressive. Ella decided to stay in the kitchen while Jake worked upstairs. She found herself drawn to an old wooden box sitting on the counter. It was intricately carved, with a lock that seemed rusted shut. As she reached for it, she heard a faint voice, almost a whisper. "Don't." She spun around, but the room was empty. Shaking, she tried to ignore the voice and pried the box open with a knife. Inside was a black key, cold to the touch, and a note written in her grandfather's handwriting. "To open is to invite them in." A sudden crash upstairs made Ella drop the key. Heart pounding, she ran to find Jake. Upstairs, Jake was standing in front of a mirror in the master bedroom. His face was pale, and his hands trembled. "Ella," he said without turning, his voice barely above a whisper. "Look." She stepped closer, and her blood ran cold. The mirror's surface was rippling like water, and behind Jake's reflection was a shadowy figure with glowing red eyes. It was impossibly tall, its bony fingers reaching for Jake's shoulders. "Move!" Ella screamed, yanking him away from the mirror. The surface immediately returned to normal, but the room was now freezing, their breaths visible in the dim light. "We need to leave," Ella said, grabbing his arm. "Now!" But as they turned to flee, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. A guttural voice echoed through the room, "You should not have come." The next hours were a blur of terror. The house seemed to come alive, its walls groaning and shifting as if something immense was moving within them. Shadows darted across their path, and whispers filled their ears, growing louder and more insistent. "The gate is open," they chanted. "It cannot be closed." In the basement, they found the source of the disturbance, a trapdoor hidden beneath a pile of rotting wood. The black key Ella had found earlier fit perfectly into the lock. She hesitated, but Jake, desperate to end the nightmare, turned it. The trapdoor flew open, revealing a pit of utter darkness. The chanting grew deafening, and from the depths, a figure began to emerge, tall, gaunt, with eyes like burning coals and a mouth that stretched impossibly wide. It clawed its way toward them, its limbs bending in unnatural angles. Jake grabbed a heavy pipe and swung it at the figure, but it passed through as if striking smoke. "Run!" he shouted. They scrambled back up the stairs, the entity following, its guttural growls echoing behind them. The house was in chaos, doors slamming and windows shattering as the thing closed in. When they finally burst outside, the storm had cleared, but the house seemed to loom even larger, its windows glowing with an eerie red light. The siblings didn't stop running until they reached their car. As they drove away, Ella glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the shadowy figure standing in the doorway, watching them. Its eyes burned brighter, and the whispers followed them long after the house disappeared from view. They never spoke of that night again. The house was demolished weeks later, but the workers refused to speak of what they found in the basement. Ella couldn't shake the feeling that whatever they had unleashed wasn't bound to the house. Late at night, she still hears whispers in her dreams. The gate is open. 1. The forest that watches. In a remote mountain town, there was a forest known as the Watching Wood. The locals avoided it, calling it cursed. They said the forest had eyes, and that anyone who ventured too deep would never return, or if they did, they were never the same. Anna was a nature photographer, skeptical of local legends. When she heard about the Watching Wood, she was intrigued. She wanted to capture its eerie beauty, ignoring the warnings from the townsfolk. Armed with her camera and a map, she set off early one morning, determined to explore. At first, the forest seemed ordinary. The tall trees stretched skyward, their branches forming a canopy that blocked most of the sunlight. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. But as Anna ventured deeper, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. No birds sang, and even the rustle of leaves seemed muted. She began to notice strange things. The trees bore markings, deep gashes that looked like claw marks. Her map made no sense, the paths twisting and leading her in circles, and then she saw it. A pair of glowing yellow eyes watching her from the shadows. She froze, her heart racing, but when she focused her camera, the eyes vanished. Shaking, she pressed on, refusing to let fear get the better of her. But the deeper she went, the more the forest seemed to close in around her. The trees appeared to shift when she wasn't looking, and whispers filled the air, faint and taunting. By dusk, Anna realized she was hopelessly lost. Her GPS didn't work, and her compass spun uselessly. As darkness fell, the glowing eyes returned, more of them this time. They surrounded her, just out of reach, always watching, The whispers grew louder, forming words, "You don't belong here." Panic set in and Anna ran. She tripped and fell, her camera smashing against a rock. When she looked up, a figure stood before her. A tall, shadowy being with elongated limbs and no face. It reached for her, and everything went black. Days later, a search party found Anna's camera near the edge of the forest. The photos on it showed nothing unusual until the final shot, a blurry image of dozens of glowing eyes and a shadowy figure standing among the trees. Anna was never found. 2. The locked door in room 13. Lucas was a traveling salesman who often stayed in small, cheap motels. One night he checked in to the Oakwood Inn, a rundown establishment with peeling wallpaper and flickering lights. The receptionist handed him the key to room 14 and warned him, "Whatever you do, stay away from room 13. Lucas chuckled at the cliché but couldn't help his curiosity. As he passed room 13, he paused. The door was unmarked, its paint chipped and worn. A strange energy seemed to radiate from it, and Lucas swore he heard faint scratching sounds coming from inside. That night, as he tried to sleep, the scratching grew louder. It wasn't coming from the walls, it was coming from room 13. Lucas got up, unable to resist. He crept into the hallway and pressed his ear to the door. The sound stopped. Then came a voice, low and guttural. "Help me." His blood ran cold. He backed away, but the door creaked open on its own. The room beyond was pitch black, the air thick and freezing. Lucas's instincts screamed at him to run, but something compelled him to step inside. The door slammed shut behind him, and the lights flickered on. The room was empty except for a single chair in the center. On the chair sat a small antique box. Lucas approached it cautiously and opened the lid. Inside was a photograph of a man, his own face staring back at him. Before he could react, the walls began to bleed and the chair tipped over. Lucas turned to flee, but the door was gone. A shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, its twisted form reaching for him. The next morning, the receptionist found Lucas's belongings in room 14, but he was nowhere to be seen. Room 13 remained locked, its secrets waiting for the next unfortunate guest. 3. The doll maker's secret. In a quiet village, there was an old doll maker named Elias who crafted the most lifelike dolls anyone had ever seen. People traveled from far and wide to purchase his creations, marveling at their delicate features and expressive eyes. But the villagers whispered that Elias's dolls were cursed, for anyone who owned one experienced terrible misfortune. Amelia, a young woman visiting the village, didn't believe the rumors. She bought a doll for her niece, charmed by its intricate design. It had soft curls, rosy cheeks, and eyes that seemed almost too real. That night, as she packed the doll in her suitcase, she felt uneasy. She could have sworn its eyes followed her as she moved about the room. Dismissing the thought, she placed the doll in the closet and went to bed. At midnight, Amelia woke to a faint tapping sound. She turned on the light and saw the closet door slightly ajar. The doll was sitting on the floor, its head tilted and one hand raised as if knocking. Amelia's breath hitched. She picked it up and threw it back into the closet, slamming the door shut. The next day, Amelia confronted Elias. "Your doll is moving on its own," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Elias's face darkened. "They always find a way back," he murmured. "You must return it to me." But it was too late. That night, the doll was waiting on her bed. Its expression had changed. its once innocent smile now a menacing grin. Amelia tried to burn it, but the flames wouldn't touch it. The doll began to whisper, "Stay with me." Amelia was found days later, her room untouched except for the doll sitting on the bed, its painted lips forming a silent laugh.